Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discoveries, our explorations, and our discussions with respect to the recent releases made by the Criterion Collection during this year of 2021. And that brings us to our focus on one particular release of a collector's set, which is under overall the spine number of 1103, but it has, as we know, a number of films contained within it. And I'd like to focus our attention on one such film within this set. The set itself is here. It is called Once Upon a Time in China, The Complete Films, this Blu-ray set that was released by the Criterion Collection early this year. And today, I would like to focus our attention on one film which is from this set. And that film is Once Upon a Time in China 3. This is the work from Tsui Hark from the year 1993, and it has among its wonderful cast people like Rosamund Kwan and John Wakefield, Lao Shun and Max Mok Siu Chung and Xiong Xinxing, and of course Jet Li, who portrays that legendary character of Wang Feihong in this work, which is, and pardon me for a very poor pronunciation,黃飛鴻之三獅王爭霸, or as it's known in English, Once Upon a Time in China 3. I think there is so much that can be said about this. As with the other works in the Once Upon a Time in China film series, this, like the other past works, has many levels, many layers upon which it operates with such grace and a type of ferocious spirit that is both energetic and also lively, as well as being very pointed in terms of a discussion of certain historical and social contexts. We are talking about the latter half or the late period of the Qing dynasty in the late part of the 19th century going into the 20th century, of course. So we have the historical context that is part of this and the other films in the series, of course, all headed by or maybe anchored by the various stories or plots or subplots surrounding this major character at the center of the proceedings, Wang Feihong. So that's one aspect of this and the other films. But also we understand too that through that type of prism, we can see this and other films as being a type of maybe representation or a discussion point of themes and motifs and also concerns that are undoubtedly very much relevant to the time in which this was made, the early 1990s, in the period leading up to or building up to or are slowly coming towards that very key moment or that very key year in terms of the trajectories of the histories between China and Hong Kong, that year being 1997. So for these and other reasons, of course, not to mention, of course, the fact that we have a continuation, a quite lovely and graceful and dynamic continuation in terms of the portrayal of martial arts, the type of epic sweep of history, as well as the wonderful threads of action and romance that are once again held together by Wang Feihong and the various characters that we meet along the way, that some of whom we have met in past films and we are meeting them again here, and other characters that we are meeting for the first time. So for these and other reasons, this film, Once Upon a Time in China 3, is a wonderful addition to the series, as well as standing on its own in terms of building on prior themes, but also working on those and leading to some very some really, in many respects, some surprising conclusions, some surprising revelations, and all the while being very entertaining along the way. Once Upon a Time in China 3. I think if we were to focus in a little bit on the plot or story or threads of story that we find or that we are enveloped in as viewers watching this film, I think we can understand that we are more or less in the latter half, or the latter part, I should say, of the Qing dynasty. And we also find ourselves in a very interesting setting in this particular film. We find ourselves now in Beijing, which is the center capital of the authority and also the center of power and government. And we also see that at the very outset, prior to the opening credits, because we see the Empress Dowager Tsui, and also we see Li Hongjiang. And so we understand that their appearance in this particular story at the very outset, prior to, in the first few minutes of the film, in fact, hint at, or perhaps more strongly, suggest this idea of a story that is dealing in one form or another with levels of power and levels of authority, both in terms of the influence on the domestic front within China itself, and we see that as expressed in the various aspects of lion dance and competition that leads to various infighting among groups, included in which are the groups that we see Wang Feihong and his father and their associates being involved with, and the rivalry that ensues from that. So there's a type of domestic infighting that seems to be connected more or less with an overall arching approach of the central government of the Qing dynasty, as personified by Empress Dowager Tsui and Li Hongjiang on the one hand. But then also the second front of that is the expressions or the relationship that we see the high levels of power engaged in terms of the outside world, in terms of international diplomacy and foreign influence or non-Chinese influence on the mainland, on culture, on human interactions, as well as on high levels of government. And we see that interaction expressed in passing, in terms of the various, representations or references that are made throughout the film whenever we see expressions of this high level, or perhaps in the context of the story, the highest level of power in terms of governmental control and influence, the Qing dynasty, Empress Dowager, and the references to, non-Chinese politicians or diplomats that we see expressed. And also we see how that is itself intertwined into the direct story of the film, because this leads to interactions involving a character, the John Wakefield character, who is named Tomansky. And perhaps there's a type of intrigue or some kind of political intrigue or suspense plot or plots or machinations that seem to be involved either directly or indirectly on this particular level. But in any event, the highest levels of government and power are represented in this film through either indirect means or direct means. And when we speak of the direct means, we also see to Wang Feihong and his entrance into the film, and his entrance, into this new realm, as it were, Beijing. Up to now, in the previous films, of course, we have seen Wang Feihong in other parts of the country, Foshan, Canton area, etc., in the first part and the second part. But now we see him away from these areas, visiting Beijing. The plot involves him and this particular group, and visiting his father, Wang Keiying, and their connections with the particular groups. And at this particular time, because of certain orders or a type of impulse towards a type of celebration or celebratory stance of nationalism, at least that's what it might seem in the surface, from Empress Dowager Tsui and Li Hongjiang and others, there's this idea of the lion dance celebration competition. And so what that is that brings into the front Wang Feihong or Wang Keiying, and a type of link between martial arts and the lion dance, and how these are some kind of forms of expression of not just a type of symbolic nationalism, but also a sense of a type of direct, innate expression of humanity and a type of philosophy, because we know from, various points of philosophical expression in this and in the prior films, as well as in, say, some of the supplementary materials focusing in on Wang Feihong. We also know that the lion dance aspect is very much linked to this idea of the training and philosophical approach towards martial arts that Wang Feihong held and espoused throughout his life. And so to see, and we've seen also the lion dance expressed in these strikingly visual terms, as well as in ways or modes or methods that I think are suggestive of a type of link towards a type of value, self-value, self-worth, expression of the self, linked towards feelings of nationalism, especially in this Qing dynasty context where we have nationalism seem to be folding over into say, influences outside of the country, etc., etc. And so it is all sort of finding voice or finding a type of cinematic expression in the context of the plot, directly speaking, in this film, the third film, with the use of the lion dance competition in the backdrop in Beijing. And so we have all these elements coming together into the fold. Now, as I mentioned, this too allows for a lot of links are among the various levels of the film. So talking about Wang Feihong for a second here, the main character, the Jet Li, as personified by Jet Li in this work. So we have the continuing, well, first of all, we have the continuing relationship between him and the various other characters that we have met in the prior film, but now we are seeing here in the third film. So for example, Long Fun here, played by Max Mock. We see the continuing relationship between him and Wang Feihong. And we also see the continuing relationship between Wang Feihong and 13th aunt, Rosamund Kwan character. Now, this is also very important, and it also further links to this idea of the external versus the internal, even in the context of historical or social dynamics, because we know that 13th aunt she spent some time abroad in terms of her education, and one of the consequences of that we see directly in this work in terms of the relationship that she seems to have with the character of Tomansky. And this leads to a number of things. This leads to the direct relationship or the direct type of love triangle that could be said to emerge between and among these characters, Wang Feihong, Tomansky, and 13th aunt. In other words, this character seems to be a type of maybe threat to the maybe the romantic intimacy or the flirtatious aspect or the mutual attraction that Wang Feihong and 13th aunt seem to have towards each other, because it's very obvious from the outset that there is also a type of warmth that exists between 13th aunt and the character of Tomansky. So there is this feeling of maybe a possibility of a love triangle. In any event, this does heighten the suspense and drama when it comes to one of the core aspects of this and other films in the series, namely the relationship between Wang Feihong and the 13th aunt. So that's one thing that comes to the fore, both directly as well as being a type of continuation from prior films. And we will probably see it echo as we get into further films in the series. So that's one key point to keep in mind. Another key point is we also see other aspects, other new developments in the Wang Feihong character. Particularly, we see the introduction of Wang Keiying, the father, portrayed by Lao Shen. We've actually seen the actor, the performer Lao Shen, in past films, but now we see him in this particular role of the father, Wang Keiying. And so this is very important too. This gives an opportunity to introduce yet another key relationship in the legend of Wang Feihong, that being the relationship between him and his father. We also see the various influences of martial arts and philosophy, the types of things that were handed down from father to son across this generational relationship. We also see, too, the context in which his father seems to be either confronting or engaging with this idea of modernism, modernity, and how that is expressed in embracing or dealing with technologies that are being introduced from outside of China. And so this is also a very important theme in the other films. So it's finding voice, a very interesting expressive voice in the context of the relationship between father and son. And so this is very important. It also shows, too, how Wang Feihong as a character is continually being confronted by these ideas of, say, for lack of a better phrase, Western influence or outside technologies that seem to be, for better or for worse, seem to be becoming more and more part of the daily fabric, the daily routine, the daily goings-on of life in China at this time. And so this is also finding voice in the father-son relationship. Incidentally, too, it finds voice so vividly in the relationship between Wang Feihong and 13th Aunt. As I mentioned before, she spent a number of years abroad. There's this relationship between her and Tomansky. And also there's the idea of the camera. The camera being, in many ways, one of the key symbols, as expressed in Once Upon a Time in China, the film series. The camera being the symbol of a type of technology or advancement of technological means or technological feat. And sometimes we see Wang Feihong, say in earlier films, in particular, say the first film, we see him almost very violently or very aggressively rejecting through some sort of plot machination. We see him rejecting the notion of the camera on the one hand, but then slowly we see the camera being integrated or becoming very integral into the plots or various scenes of, say, character development and sort of a type of seeing characters, say, look at themselves, being fascinated by the camera, fascinated by the process of taking photographs, the moving image. There's a real lovely moment in this film, the third film, where we see the group watching the moving image, and we see actual people being depicted, and they're watching themselves on screen. So there's this type of magic, almost meta moment in terms of cinema capturing cinema, as it were. And we see to Wang Feihong gradually accepting this type of technology where he might have otherwise rejected it in past films through some form or another. So through this type of relationship dynamic as expressed by the father, 13th Aunt, and also what Tomansky brings to the table, and the symbolism of things like the camera, etc., we see also the further development and change, and perhaps, dare I say it, a type of evolution, as it were, in the character of Wang Feihong himself. This, too, plays into the plot very significantly, as we know. So when we think about the camera, not only does the image of the camera and the symbol of the camera seem to be linked to or represent or somehow suggest something of a change or some kind of alteration in the character makeup of Wang Feihong himself, it also forms a very key plot detail. I don't want to get too much into the plot here, except to say, perhaps in very vague terms, that the camera does play a very vital role, and perhaps even more specific, what the camera captures and how that plays a part in the overall plot involving the high ranks of power, intrigue, mystery, some kind of plot of takeover or assassination or whatever the case may be. And so all of it links together with the camera, and the camera too becomes a focal point for the development of the relationships, or it becomes another echo of the representations of, say, East and West, tradition and versus modernity, the idea of technology and how it relates to the self and the spirit, especially in films like this where the self and spirit are expressed through the philosophy as shown by the adherence towards principles of martial arts that are shown through the actions and movements of the body and mind and spirit, as well as, say, expressions of pride and glory, and indeed dominance, perhaps, and artistry through the lion dance, etc. So it's all here in these various levels that we see played themselves out in Once Upon a Time in China 3. And so it's very exciting. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that we also have, therefore, wonderful displays of action and adventure, and that those displays of action and adventure, I think, are find voice in the various fight scenes choreographed here. This time we have the action choreography, martial arts direction credited to Yuan Bun. And Yuan Bun will be someone who we will see figure very prominently in the series from this point on. So we will keep that in mind when we explore other films. But we also we have this idea of action choreography expressed here, focusing a lot on the lion dance aspect. But as I mentioned before, this is, I think, very appropriate when we think about the legend of Wang Feihong and how important the lion dance was to the historical figure of Wang Feihong, and how it's key to the martial arts expression itself. Also, when we're talking about the struggle, the martial arts fighting, the infighting, and how that's too linked to the domestic versus external, the domestic intrigue, the capital, and all the non-Chinese, the external outside influences, how that might play a role. Part of the reason, as we know, that this lion dance seems to be taking place is to somehow, perhaps, maybe, create the sense of national pride in among the people. But also there is the way in which, and this is expressed in the plot early on, how this lion dance is also sowing the seeds of, say, treachery and rivalry, and in fact infighting on the domestic front. And we see this expressed in the various forms of fighting, the sort of the group rivalry, gang infighting that we see take place, and Wang Feiheng and Wang Keiying and others are involved directly in. And this also forms another subplot, because we see in this emerge the character of Clubfoot 7, and how he becomes this figure of antagonism. He is a type of antagonistic force in the eyes of Wang Feiheng and others, and we see that displayed in such wonderful feats of martial arts prowess, especially the use of the feet, the lower part of the body, the feet choreography, and the fastness and quickness of the kicking action. And but we also know that the film shows two separate and distinct aspects of this relationship, and the character of Clubfoot, who I say is a type of antagonistic figure, but we realize there will be much more to the relationship between Clubfoot and Wang Feiheng as this film develops. And so this forms a wonderful, I think, heartbeat to the film, which is, again, linked to many other aspects, right? Because we have in this expression, and particularly in, as found in terms of establishing a cinematic voice in the form of Shang Xinxing's performance as Clubfoot 7. And of course, we've seen Shang Xinxing appear in other roles in this series, most notably in the second film, the film prior to this. But now we see him performing or portraying a new character, a different character. And so there is this antagonistic level, and how that character represents this, it's directly involved in the plot that Wang Feiheng is involved in this film. It is also, on another level, representative of a type of domestic infighting, factional infighting that seems to be taking place, because he is also very directly involved in that, because he is part of the clashes between his side and also the side of father and son, Wang Feiheng, Wang Keiying, Liang Fun, etc. So that's his character is representative of the infighting. Now, that infighting too is also linked to the higher levels of power, Empress Dowager Tsui and others, because that it's the whole reason why this whole thing is taking place in the first place. The lion dance, which is also linked to a type of expression of nationalistic pride, but also clashes between external and internal. And where will this lead? Where will all this lead? Will it lead down a type of maybe sense of nihilistic hopelessness, or will there be a sense of hope at the end of the road? Will there be some light at the end of the tunnel, as it were? And I should say that it really depends on your point of view and your interpretation of this particular work, because it is quite a complex work indeed. There is a lot of treachery. There is a lot of betrayal. There is also a lot of, say, hidden agendas. Characters seem to be hiding who it is they really are. Things that appear one way on the surface are actually quite different. Or perhaps things seem one way at first, but then they change into something else by some midway point or by the end of the film. And indeed, that's true of characters and persons. And that's certainly true for a lot of characters here. Some characters, they are certainly different than what they appear, or there are other characters that start one way, but then throughout the film, they turn into something completely different. Now, those sorts of changes or those sorts of hidden agendas in this film could be indicative, as I say, of a type of nihilistic viewpoint or type of hopeless viewpoint that one could say is being expressed through some form or another in this film, Once Upon a Time in China. But I should say, too, that there's also, through the type of strength of will of a character of Wang Feiheng and the strong example that he and his disciples and his close circle represent, as expressed obviously, as anchored most fully by Wang Feiheng himself, the type of philosophy that is ultimately one of the great examples of a type of martial arts philosophy. And while maybe not all the characters that we meet will become disciples and follow his path, there will be some hope in that department too. And perhaps where we see some people convert or turn towards the cause, or maybe become followers of Wang Feiheng and what it is he believes, this too might be that way in which this film is expressing a type of light at the end of the tunnel, a type of sense of hope and pride, notwithstanding the various currents of change, the inevitable forces of change that either through good or bad will certainly be things that the culture and nation and history will have no choice but to confront, as it's shown in a very type of wonderfully microcosmic, entertaining form as this film Once Upon a Time in China 3. So there is some hope. There is also some glimmers of, say, the inevitable. There is also a sense of high powers, movements beyond one's control, and how this in turn might lead to a sense of maybe direct hopelessness, but also ultimately in the long run there's something much more at stake. That is a sense of pride in oneself, individual worth, and how that ultimately finds voice and expression in the long run, or whether it be in the form of political or social movement, democracy and the like, or in the type of individual spirit, mind and body peace, unity that seems to be embodied in that martial arts philosophy that we find expressed so wonderfully and so vividly in a film like this, Once Upon a Time in China 3. So the Criterion Collection has, as we know, released this set in physical media Blu-ray form, Once Upon a Time in China, the complete films, and among which is the third film, Once Upon a Time in China 3, and that has been the focus of discussion today. And so let us focus in on the Criterion release of this particular film. It is on the third disc of this Blu-ray set, and we have various things to keep in mind here. So first of all, we have the audio options. Let me talk about that first. We have the Chinese Cantonese monaural option, and then we have the original Cantonese stereo option as well. So my understanding is that this film, when it was released, it had the soundtrack in stereo, and so that's why it is described as being, or the stereo track is described as being, the original Cantonese stereo. Also we have the aspect ratio 2.39 to 1. Again, this is from 1993. We should point out, like with other films here, there have been other past non-Criterion releases of this film where there might have been other language tracks available, a Mandarin language track or an English language track available. So here for the Criterion release, just like in the past films, we don't have any other language option except for the variants of the language tracks, stereo, monaural, whatever the case may be, in the language of Cantonese. So, but for someone like me, as I've mentioned before, I am okay with this because I have always watched these films, or I'm used to these films in the Cantonese language soundtrack versions, and so to have those options available alone still is more than enough for me. I'm very happy with that. And there's also, as I say, the choice with what's described as being the original stereo track or the monaural track, so whatever you prefer. Just keep that in mind, of course. But that also means that for anyone who is seeking, say, more breadth of scope in terms of availability of language tracks, audio tracks, etc., of course, please go elsewhere. And I should say, too, same goes for commentary tracks, too. Unfortunately, like with other films in this release, unlike, say, with other past non-Criterion releases, here we're not getting any commentary track option, which is a shame. It really is a shame. It would have been wonderful if there would have been either commentary tracks taken from prior releases, or if Criterion could have created a new commentary track. For instance, I've mentioned it before, and I'll say it again, Tony Raines has a wonderful interview on one of the earlier discs, and so it just makes me wonder what it would have been like had Tony Raines been able to create a commentary track for one or more of the films here. So, but in any event, we're not getting commentary tracks, so if you are seeking that, you're going to have to go elsewhere for other non-Criterion options for that. But there are other strengths to this particular Criterion release, which I have touched upon earlier, and I will probably go into more detail maybe when we talk about the other entries in the series, specifically 4 and 5. So stay tuned to those in separate videos. Now, speaking of the Criterion release here, so this is purported to be based upon a 4K digital restoration, and so this is according to the credits of the film as we find it in the Criterion release. It seems to have been at or around the year 2018 or so. So it's very recent, at least in the context or in the timing related to this particular video. So a few years ago at least. And so the restoration is one that is very different than, say, the earlier non-restoration versions that people might be used to when they saw this film starting from the early 90s into, say, various releases on DVD or the like leading up to the restoration version. So for me personally, I can say that I've seen this film more in the non-restored versions than I have in the restored version. And so I'm used to it more in the non-restored version than I'm used to. And so with that type of maybe base knowledge, and I admit I am not at all an expert when it comes to this or other films, but just based on my own personal experience, I can tell you that there are a number of differences that one can notice when it comes to the restoration version versus the prior version. And I should say too that I'm not yet sure which I prefer, but I do appreciate what the restoration version provides. But I should just point out, just as some details that I've noticed. Again, I think there have been some great observations made in other, say, reviews or online forum communities or the like. People really know, experts in Once Upon a Time in China series, they have gone through and they have details about what the differences are, even between, say, Criterion and Eureka. So this is really quite wonderful. I am in no way equipped to provide that level of detail. I can only go with my own personal experience, which I admit is nowhere near the level of expertise like, say, others, but just based on what I know and what I've sensed. So there are some marked differences. So for example, the opening credit sequence, which has this wonderful use of the theme song and also the lion dance, and the training montage of sorts, which is echoing the title sequences that we saw in the first film and the second film, but in a different setting, a very interesting setting. The title sequence actually, there are differences in, say, the font used, and in fact, too, there are differences in the actual titling used. Sometimes we have titles where someone's name is mentioned here in this version, but not mentioned in another version. So sometimes the titles themselves can be different, not for all of them, but for a couple of the title screens themselves, there are some differences. Also, if you listen carefully, you'll note that the music is actually synced a little bit differently. I think it starts a little bit at a different place with one version versus the other. So in other words, if you have the same title appear on the screen, the music won't necessarily be at the same place. So it's a little bit, it's moved a little bit in terms of when it starts and when it ends, and that changes slightly the dynamic of the title sequence. Not by much, but just by a little bit, I would say. Also, there are some really interesting differences, or maybe not so interesting, I guess, depending on your point of view. In terms of color timing, I mean, I can mention, for instance, some scenes of rain and darkness that perhaps are meant to be nighttime, or that aren't, or that seem to be night but then turn. So there's this kind of interesting dynamic, and they happen in quite dramatic moments of the film, especially involving one of the key relationships in the film, that being Wang Fei Hong and Clubfoot. But those, we see slight levels of difference in those key scenes. Again, not to the extent that they affected me in a negative way in viewing this particular version, but they are noticeable. Also, I should point out too, there are some, I'm not sure if it's an error or not. The more I think about it, the more probably it's not an error, but again, I'm not sure. There's an example that happens early on in the pre-title sequence of the film, and it involves the character, a close-up of Li Hongjiang in this hall, in this palace hall. And in the non-restoration version, or the prior versions, it's kind of one wide shot, and we see him standing in the middle or bowing in the middle. But in the Criterion restoration version that we have here, almost half of the screen is blacked out. And so I'm not sure if this is an error, but if you look closely, the line isn't perfect. There's actually a little bit of a protrusion outward, which might seem to suggest that it's meant to be a pillar of some sort. I don't know. In fact, there are pillars in the background. So that is a kind of interesting detail. And again, I'm not a strong enough expert to know about this, but again, I'm used to that particular shot where there's a full frame and actually there's some information on what from my vantage point, it would be the left-hand portion of the screen, in fact, which isn't present, at least to my eye, when I see the restoration version that's present in the Criterion release. So those and other details, I think, are examples of where I find this restoration version to be something where it is. There are moments where it's, oh, this is something that I'm not quite used to. Now, I will say too that it doesn't reach the point of me being totally. It doesn't. I'm not distracted by it, but I do notice it. And I must say that I have a tendency to want to focus in on, say, the non-restoration version rather than the restoration version. That's not to say that I dislike the restoration version, but just at this point, I'm still fond of the version that I'm used to. But I will do my best to watch this particular version. And indeed, for people who are watching this film for the first time, and maybe this Criterion release is your first exposure to this and other films, this is a great place to go. So no need to worry on that front. Again, these are just minor details, maybe from that perspective. Again, for people who know these films, they are not minor details. They can be quite major and significant details, and I completely understand that. But in any event, I don't think, at least for me in my own personal experience, this is perfectly adequate. While I might have certain preferences elsewhere, this is, I think, perfectly adequate. And I'm very happy to be able to continue to explore the films through this version. Going forward. I should say, let's see. Also, I should say too that, again, I understand that maybe there might be some differences in terms of the subtitle translation. Now, unfortunately am not at all an expert or speaker of the language, so I can't tell which is more accurate or which isn't. But I think, again, from my experience, I know that I'm missing out on a number of things in this film, like I do with any other film where the language is one that I'm not familiar with, because I am wholly reliant on the subtitles. And so perhaps subtitling is a very difficult art form, and I can appreciate that. So there might be things that I am missing out on, but I can feel that I'm still getting the sense and scope of the film, more or less. And maybe for those who are interested in trying to get more nuance and more depth and more exploration, of course, I recommend getting as many versions as you can and many different translations as you can. That's not true only for films and for this particular film, but that's true for basically anything, really, in terms of any, say, work of art or literature. For instance, literature, that's definitely the case, translations in literature. The more translations I think one can be exposed to, I think the better one can get a sense in terms of the similarities and differences. Even if one isn't fluent in the language, there can be this sense of what one can catch to a certain degree anyway. And those nuances of language are very important. It's impossible to catch oftentimes unless one is a speaker of the language per se. But there are these opportunities, let me put it that way. So if you are interested in that direction, then I can probably recommend that type of exploration. But if not, if this one set is your option, then I think you're perfectly fine with this particular release and the subtitling and what it has to offer, etc. So this is my general impression in terms of the release that's included here with the Criterion set. With regard to the supplements that are found with the third disc, now I should again point out again that this is a multi-disc Blu-ray set. On each disc is one of the films, and then also there is a supplements menu, and so we have supplements that accompany each of these discs. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes those supplements are tailored or keyed to the specific film, or if not, they would be talking about the series as a whole. So, but in any event, with the third disc, which has the third film, we also have a set of supplements. So what are the supplements that are found on disc 3 of this set? The first is an interview described as being from 1994, approximately 22 minutes. This is an interview with Tsui Hark, the director. And here we have something that actually has been made available in other channels before, I understand. But it's always great to have this particular discussion. We have his take on the themes of the films, and we've seen this in past other discs, supplements where Tsui Hark has been interviewed or he's speaking to the camera. And so he's talking about his approach to Wang Feihong, the importance of the figure of Wang Feihong, as in his words or in his viewpoint, a character that is on the one hand a type of superhero character legend type. I mean, Wang Feihong is a legendary character both in terms of history and in cinema, all the way up to prior to this new Wang Feihong series, the Once Upon a Time in China series. But at the same time, in the hands of Tsui Hark and others in this new version, we have a superhero type that is not always right. Not always right. Now, this is a very key concept because Wang Feihong is strong, Wang Feihong is heroic, but also Wang Feihong is seen as being not always correct. Maybe Wang Feihong is sometimes seen as being sometimes almost out of his depth, sometimes ill-equipped to handle certain aspects of, say, language. There are sometimes issues of language. Sometimes he can speak, sometimes he can't speak. Sometimes that's to his disadvantage, but sometimes that is turned to his advantage, especially in the context of his relationship between him and 13th Aunt. So that's an example of where he might be seen to be in a type of vulnerable position. Also, not just in terms of vulnerability, we also see Wang Feihong in situations and choices where he might be seen to be making maybe the wrong choice. He might be lashing out or maybe making some conclusion that is ultimately not in his favor. We as the viewers might have some extra information that might lead us into a different conclusion than he. But in any event, this is leading or providing, I think, a wonderful basis for Tsui Hark and his approach to Wang Feihong as a legendary character, as a character of great prowess and prominence, both in real-life historical terms and also in the sort of cinematic historical terms that we see play themselves out in these various films. Because as we know, sometimes we're not seeing documentaries, real-life enactments of real-life historical events all the time, but we are seeing items and representations of history expressed in these cinematic terms in the hands of Tsui Hark. And so even in that context, we understand that maybe Wang Feihong makes decisions. Sometimes they are right, maybe a lot of times they are right, but sometimes they are not right. And so that type of vulnerability and also that type of willingness to show almost a fallibility of the character while still maintaining a grace and excitement and heroism in the character. This is, I think, a really key concept. Also, the idea of the melding or merging of special effects and also choreography in terms of telling or maintaining the dynamism, the excitement and action of the film. Also, concepts of Hong Kong filmmaking, the idea of movie magic, the idea of trying to capture the attention of the audience, talking a little bit about his career in terms of his experiences, in terms of producing, in terms of acting and directing. There's a point where he talks about the differences from his perspective in terms of being a director versus being a producer. He says the producer is meant to express the sober side of the creative process, whereas the director expresses the emotional side of the creative process. Now, I'm not an artist, so I can't really claim to know directly firsthand experience-wise, but I can maybe kind of get a sense of what he means when he's talking about the producer. Oftentimes there are many maybe sort of financial arrangements that need to be made, certain overall commitments that need to be made on a business side, whereas maybe the director side has a direct line with the artistic expression of a particular framed moment, etc., that is formed on the basis of a lot of the business negotiations and decisions and financial arrangements, etc. So there's a sober side versus an emotional side. It's a really interesting take on the artistic creative process that Tsui Hark and others are engaged in. At least Tsui Hark is engaged in. So this is another great example of the perspective, the cinematic perspective, directly from the artist himself, Tsui Hark. So if you haven't checked it out already, please do. Maybe if you know or if you have prior versions of this, chances are you might have seen this already, but if you haven't, it's worth taking a look because it is very, very valuable indeed. So this is, again, approximately 22 minutes. And then moving on, we have another interview. This time, this is from 2012. This is with the actor-performer John Wakefield, approximately 10 minutes. This is also something that people might have seen if they have seen this film in other prior releases. But if you haven't, this is a great opportunity to see this interview. John Wakefield's interview, he plays the character who's described as Tomansky in this film. And so he talks a little bit about his experience, his experience working in television, in terms of his experience working with Tsui Hark and how he got into this film, how certain processes were really interesting to work with. For instance, he recalls how sometimes he would be given new lines of dialogue at the moment and he'd be expected to memorize them in a very, very short period of time. But at the same time, there is a bit of irony when it comes to that particular aspect of shooting, because ultimately he realized that even though he can speak the language, there was a lot of post-dubbing occurring. So perhaps it didn't really matter ultimately if he flubbed a line on set or not, because it could have been dubbed later. But in any event, this was the type of situation he was finding on the set. So this is very interesting. He's talking about working in the Cantonese language, working with Jet Li, working with Rosamund Kwan, etc. And he talks about certain advantages, certain disadvantages in this type of environment, this working relationship with Tsui Hark, his observations about how Tsui Hark works as an artist on set in the moment. It's a very interesting, very enlightening approach and observations from John Wakefield. Again, he plays a very key character in this film, Once Upon a Time in China 3. So it's really wonderful to get his insight into the process itself, and also a little bit of insight into working with the performance as well as working with Tsui Hark, etc. It's approximately 10 minutes. As I say, if you've seen or if you have passed other non-Criterion releases, chances are you might have seen this already. If not, this is a wonderful opportunity to check it out if you haven't. So this is the interview with John Wakefield. Then continuing on, the supplements have a 20-minute deleted scenes section. And so these are deleted scenes, or maybe parts of scenes that maybe have a fundamental inclusion in the film, but maybe their parts have been excised or deleted, or maybe actual components have been deleted. It's all in this compilation. Again, approximately 20 minutes overall. It also is a reminder of the fact that there may have been other release versions of the film, and so we're not getting any other release versions of the film. So the only hint that we have, or the only suggestion that we can get in terms of other release versions, is through this particular deleted scene section. So if you are interested in what that might have to offer, I think this can be something that is well worthwhile. But again, it makes one wonder, if only Criterion or other, if they could have included, say, other release versions, that would have been an interesting point of a comparison if they were made available. But in any event, we get this particular reference point. So please check it out if you're interested. And then the supplements are rounded out with a trailer. This is approximately 3 minutes. So that, I think, can conclude our discussion of the supplements found on Disc 3, which again is the disc that is for Once Upon a Time in China 3. Now, in terms of the supplements, perhaps those who know this particular film series and know it through other releases will probably see that maybe not all of the supplements that have been made for this film in prior non-Criterion releases, not everything is included here, unfortunately. And that is also true, as I mentioned earlier, for commentary tracks. That's one of the weaknesses of this release from Criterion, to be perfectly honest, is there's no commentary track inclusion. So that is, I would say, a shame. Commentary tracks, I think, are really valuable, potentially valuable anyway. And to at least have that option, I think, would have been really awesome. So if you're looking for that option, you're going to have to go elsewhere, unfortunately. But on the plus side, there are a lot of strengths to this particular set. And I will go into those strengths the way I see it anyway when we talk about other films included. 4 and 5 in particular. But if we think now, for purposes of this video, if you think about this film, Once Upon a Time in China 3, it might not necessarily, I mean, I know too that sometimes for some people, maybe after the extraordinary heights that were reached in the immediately prior film, Part 2, maybe 3 might be seen as a little bit of maybe going down a little bit of a notch from some people's perspective. But I should say, I really want to emphasize that this film, Once Upon a Time in China 3, really cements a lot of the themes that we saw worked so gloriously in the first film and the second film, and they are worked or reworked in a real, almost wonderfully, poetically aggressive fashion in this third film. So that suggests a real strong flow of continuity between and among these films. Also, there's the presence of Jet Li and others. In particular, Jet Li, we understand that his appearance in 1, 2, and 3 make the sense of a trilogy. And so I think a lot of people see this as a type of capping off of the themes that were seen in the first and second films. And maybe in terms of the martial arts fight scenes, maybe it's hard to top, say, the climactic fights that we saw in, say, Part 2. But still, I want to emphasize here, too, that the lion dance is really a key component. Such a key component, and it's integrated so fluidly into the workings of the martial arts fight choreography here. And it's also so key to the story, as well as being a key component to Wang Feiheng and his martial arts philosophy himself. So in that way, I think this film stands out in that particular mode. And so there are a lot of highlights in that form. And so in those and other ways, I am so taken with this film. In terms of where it comes from, in terms of its workings with the other films, and where it ends up as it concludes. And my goodness, the way it concludes, wow, what a powerful, powerful conclusion it is indeed. Now, one of the strengths, and I do want to end here, I know that the third film, as I say, is often marketed and is often seen as a type of trilogy. But one of the strengths is that this set looks at this and regards this cycle of films as a cycle, and so each grows off of each other, or they are interlinked with and among each other, and that also includes 4 and 5. And so I'm looking forward to the conversations about 4 and 5 going forward. But just talking about 3, that means too that 3 acts on its own. It also works as a type of companion work to the other films, both past and also future. And also it is a reminder just of the type of fluid dynamism, the idea of change and evolution, the idea of modernism and tradition that is wrapped not just in the story, but also in the filmmaking and cinematic prowess itself. This is a wonderful example of the Once Upon a Time in China series from Tsui, Hark and Company. This is the work Once Upon a Time in China 3. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.